Men of Iron, Chapter 2. From the time the family escaped from Falworth Castle that midwinter night, at the time Miles was 16, he knew nothing of the great world beyond Crosberry Dale. A fair was held twice in a 12-month at the market town of Wisby, and 3 times in the 7 years. Old Deacon Bowman took the lad to see the sights of that place. Beyond these 3 glimpses of the outer world, he lived almost as secluded a life as one of the monks of St. Mary's Priory. Crosby Dale, their new home, was different enough from Falworth or Eastbridge Castle, the former baronial seats of Lord Falworth. It was a long, low, straw-thatched farmhouse. Once, when the church lands were divided into 2 holdings, it was one of the bailiff's houses. All around them were the fruitful farms of the priory, tilled by well-to-do tenant-holders, and rich with fields of wavering grain and meadowlands. In those days, the church lands were under church rule, and were governed by church laws, and there, when war and famine blighted the outside world, harvests flourished. The Priory of St. Mary's owed much, if not all, of the church's prosperity to the blind Lord Falworth, and now he was paying it back with a haven of refuge for his former patron. I wonder what boys today would have thought of Miles' training. With him the training was not only of the mind, but of the body as well, and for 7 years it was almost unremitting. "Ye have your own way to make in the world," his father said more than once, when the boy complained of the grinding hardness of his life. And to make one's way in those days meant 1,000 times more than it does now. It meant not only a heart to feel and a brain to think, but a hand quick and strong to strike in battle, and a bloody tough to endure the wounds and blows in return. And so it was that Miles' body was well as his mind had to be trained to meet the needs of the dark age in which he lived. Every morning, winter or summer, rain or shine, he tramped away 6 long miles to the priory school, and even in the evenings his mother taught him French. "Why must I learn that vile tongue?" asked he. "Call it not vile," said the blind old lord grimly. "When ye are a grown man, ye'll have to seek your fortune in France, for England is no place for those of Falworth blood." And in after years, true to prediction, the vile tongue served him well. As for his physical training, that pretty well filled up the hours between his morning studies at the monastery and his evening studies at home. Then it was that old Deacon Bowman took him in hand. The old Bowman had served with Lord Falworth's father under the Black Prince, both in France and in Spain, and in long years of war had gained a practical knowledge of arms that few could surpass. Besides the use of the broadsword, the short sword, the quarterstaff, and the cudgel, he taught Miles to shoot so skillfully with the longbow and the crossbow that not a lad in the countryside was his match at the village butts. Attack and defense with the lance, and throwing the knife and dagger were also part of his training. Then, in addition to this more regular part of his physical training, Miles was taught in another branch, not so often included in the military education of the day, the art of wrestling. It happened that a fellow lived in Crosby village, by name Ralph the Smith, who was the greatest wrestler in the countryside, and had won the champion belt for 3 years. Every Saturday afternoon, in fair weather, he came to teach Miles the art. And being wonderfully adept in bodily feats, Miles soon could cast any lad under 20. "It is an ungentle almscraft that he learns," said Lord Falworth one day to Priory Edward. "Except for the broadsword, the dagger, and lance, there is but little that a gentleman of his birth may use. Nevertheless, he gains quickness and suppleness, and if he was true blood in his veins, he will acquire knightly arts shrewdly quick when the time comes to learn them." But hard and grinding as Miles' life was, it was not entirely without pleasures. There were many boys living at Crosby Dale, and the village yeomen and farmers' sons, to be sure, but nevertheless lads of his own age. and that, after all, is the main requirement for friendship in a boyhood's world. Then there was the river to bathe in. There were the hills and valleys to roam over. Once he gained a triumph that for many a day was very sweet. As was said before, he had been 3 times to the market town at fair time, and on the last of these occasions he had fought a bout of quarterstaff with a young fellow of 20, and had been the conqueror. He was but 14. Old Decoon, who had gone with him to the fair, had met some cronies of his own, with whom he had sat gossiping in the ale-booth, leaving Miles to shift for himself. By and by the old man had noticed a crowd gathered at one part of the fairground, and, sensing a fight, had gone running, ale-pot in hand. Then, peering over the shoulders of the crowd, he had seen his young master, stripped to the waist, fighting like a gladiator with a fellow a head taller than himself. Decoon was about to force his way through the crowd and drag them asunder, but a second look had showed his practised eye that Miles was not only holding his own, but was in the way of winning the victory. So he stood with the others looking on, withholding himself from any interference and whatever upbraiding might be necessary until the fight had been brought to a triumphant close. Lord Falworth never heard directly of the redoubtable fair, but old Decoon was not so silent with the common folk of Crosbey Dale, and so no doubt the father had some inkling of what had happened. It was shortly after this notable event that Miles was formally initiated into squirehood. His father and mother, as was the custom, stood sponsors for him. By them, each bearing a lighted taper, he was escorted to the altar. It was at St. Mary's Priory, and Priory Edward blessed the sword and girded it to the lad's side. No one was present but the 4, and when the good prior had given the benediction, and had signed the cross upon his forehead, Miles's mother stooped and kissed his brow. Henceforth Miles had the right to wear a sword. Miles had ended his 15th year. He had a bony brown face, curling hair, a square, strong chin, and a pair of merry, laughing blue eyes. His shoulders were broad, his chest was thick of girth, and his muscles were as tough as oak. The day upon which he was 16, as he came whistling home from the monastery school, he was met by Deacon Bowman. "Master Miles," said the old man, with a snuffle in his voice. "Master Miles, your father would see you in his chamber, and bade me send you to him as soon as he did come home." "Oh, fast, Master Miles, I fear me ye are going to leave home." Miles stopped short. "Leave home?" he cried. "Aye," said old Deacon. "Ye may go to some grand castle to live, and be a page there, and then a gentleman-at-arms with some great lord's pay." "What is this about castles and lords and gentlemen-at-arms?" said Miles. "Are ye jesting?" "Nay," said Deacon, "I am not jesting, but go to your father, and then ye will presently know all. Only I do say it is likely ye leave us tomorrow." And so it was as Deacon had said. Miles was to leave home the very next morning. He found his father and mother and Prior Edward waiting. "We 3 have been talking it over this morning," said his father, "and think that the time has come for you to quit this poor home of ours. If ye stay here 10 years longer, ye will be no more fit to go than are now. Tomorrow I will give you a letter to my kinsman, the Earl of Mackworth. He has thrived in these days, and I have fallen. But time was that he and I were true sworn companions, and plighted together in friendship never to be sundered. I think, as I remember him, he will abide by his plighted troth, and will give you his aid to rise in the world. So, as I said, tomorrow morning ye shall set forth with Deacon Bowman, and shall go to Castle Devlin, and there deliver this letter, which prays him to give you a place in his household. Ye may have this afternoon to yourself to make ready such things as ye shall take with you. And said Deacon to me, he must take the grey horse to the village, and have it shod." Prior Edward had been standing looking out of the window as Lord Falworth ended. He turned. "And Miles," said he, "ye will need some money, so I will give you as a loan 40 shillings, which some day ye may return to me." For know this, Miles, a man cannot do in the world without money. Your father has it ready for you in the chest, and I will give it to you tomorrow before you go." The next morning Miles, with the old bowman, rode out into the great world to seek his fortune.